Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Entrepreneurship. Welcome to City College of San Francisco. I know, again, we have people who are joining us for the first time. So I will be giving this short introduction about who we are before I turn you over to our guest speaker this afternoon. So welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Vivian Faustino. I am the founder and the program lead for the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation here at City College of San Francisco. I'm also a business faculty and has been with the college since 2012. I just want to start by introducing the center, and again, for those who was joining us only for the first time. The center was designed to be an incubator of ideas for aspiring entrepreneurs and to prepare very early stage startups to get their ideas to market and to scale. And it was founded with the goal of making entrepreneurship education accessible and inclusive. Today, entrepreneurship goes beyond just starting a small business. I think many of you, especially those who are registered in the program, would agree to that. But entrepreneurship is also about starting a venture for economic and social impact. We also position the center to prepare students for another path to socioeconomic mobility aside from employment. Founders can create jobs not only for themselves, but also for their own communities. The entrepreneurship program has six different tracks: business, culinary arts, fashion, broadcast, visual media design, and journalism. In addition to these programs, we offer vital resources for our budding entrepreneurs, such as a series of workshops and lectures, just like this one that you would be hearing today. This is facilitated by industry thought leaders with real life experience on functional areas of business. And these are designed to humanize concepts covered in class and to complement the academic frameworks that we are teaching in the classroom. In addition, we have access to entrepreneurs in residence to coach and mentor our students in all or various areas of entrepreneurship. And finally, students are given the opportunity to pitch their idea to a panel of judges who are themselves successful entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, or angel investors. The pitch and demo day is the culmination of all the students' hard work and is also open to our San Francisco startup community to get the exposure to potential users and funders. All of these are available to everyone within City College of San Francisco and also beyond. And with all this, I'd like to turn you over to our speaker today. I would just provide a very brief introduction because I think that Jared can also add more to what I'm going to say. So Jared leads Intuit's financial readiness program. I'm sure that most of us here is very familiar with Intuit, which is the company behind QuickBooks. Considering that tax payment season is coming up very soon, I think we are all now really getting familiar and acquainted again with Intuit and QuickBooks. So the program, the financial readiness program, aims to empower students to make smart money decisions and own their financial futures. And as an innovation catalyst with deep expertise in personal finance, Jared serves as a board member for the Jumpstart Coalition, a committee member for the New York State Comptroller on Personal Finance, and has been tasked with designing the Congressional Award's first ever personal finance program. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jared Davidove.
Thank you, Vivian. I appreciate it. So excited to be here today with all of you. I traditionally tend to actually guest speak or lecture for more personal finance classes. So I don't actually do this very often with entrepreneurship, and I love doing it with entrepreneurship because what it does is it ties my day job to my actual small business that I own. So it's kind of a mixture of both. So I'll in a second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. But for those of you that do have your cameras on, I thank you. So I see Linda, Holly, Mary, and several others. So last time I did a guest lecture, I was just telling Vivian and everyone else, I offered extra credit to the rest of the students, which I obviously can't do, not as their professor. So I'm going to offer something different this time. So if I can ask potentially Tim, Vivian, or Marina, if you guys capture people who either A, turn their cameras on or participate, we have a bunch of these like Intuit Education Yeti mugs. I will send the team some of these over and they can send them out to some of the students. So that is my offer for today instead of extra credit, because I can't exactly offer extra credit. So let me go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. And if I can figure out, give me 1 second here.
Sorry, what is your small business?
I will go through that. Don't worry. So give me 1 second. Optimize. Okay, sweet. Oops, I'm clicking way too fast here. Come on. My buttons aren't working. Reset. Sorry about this. Why can't I go back? All right. I'm going to have to exit and go back to the beginning. Awesome. Okay. And can everybody now see my screen? Okay, from the beginning, we should be good. Awesome, getting some thumbs up. So again, thank you, Vivian, and everyone here for having me. Super excited, love doing this. So my name is Jared Davidove. I lead financial readiness for Intuit. What does that mean? How we teach personal finance and entrepreneurship to high school students and to university students. So whether that ranges from financial management to personal finance, to taxes, to QuickBooks with small business, kind of like the whole gambit of the spectrum. I also, one business that I have started and still continue to work on today, I've tried many, but this is the one that's been longest standing for the last 6+ years. It's custom fantasy rings, which sounds kind of a little bit out there. It's a very small niche market, and I'll walk through everything that we do, but essentially, I create basically Super Bowl rings for fantasy football champions. So if you're not familiar with fantasy football, imagine a fictional version of the NFL, and people get to make their own teams. And then when you win the Super Bowl or that version of, you get to make a ring. And so really what we create and design are these half-a-pound rings that stick on your finger. So you can see they're pretty big. But again, it's not fancy software. It's not, you know, electronic tech. It is purely simply costume jewelry. And it's been, you know, it helps fulfill me. And I have a big passion for not only fantasy football, but the NFL in general. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So what we are actually going to cover today, and actually while I'm doing this, let me pull up the chat. So I am going to have the chat over or up on the side. So if you guys don't want to turn yourself off of mute and you want to ask questions through the chat, please feel free. I will have that up on the side and I'll be able to answer those. We're going to go quickly through Intuit. I'll also walk through a little bit about custom fantasy rings. And throughout this whole process, what I'm going to do is I'm not only just going to talk about the entrepreneurial sort of aspects around financial management, but I want to tie personal finance into this, as well as give you some real examples that happened to me that I went through when starting my business. And so we'll do that really as we go through kind of the small business review, go through some really important financial statements. We'll go through cash flow management. What does that mean? Why is it critical for small business and startups? And then last but not least, I'm going to open it up to everyone here on the call for a little bit of Q&A. I, for the most part, get the most out of the Q&A. I love working with everyone here and kind of talking and loving hearing the questions that you guys have. So I'll make sure that we have time for that at the end. All right, so really quickly, show of hands or with the thumbs up reaction. Who's heard of Intuit before coming on here today? All right, I see some, I don't see everyone. So now my question for you is who's heard of TurboTax or who's heard of QuickBooks? Okay, that's a little bit usually more like it. I get a roughly about 70% of people, so on and so forth, have heard of Intuit. And then I usually ask, okay, who's heard of TurboTax? And that's when everyone usually raises their hands, because what in life can you not avoid, right? It's death and taxes. So outside of TurboTax, we also have QuickBooks, which is the #1 small business accounting software. So you guys probably are pretty familiar with it as either looking to become budding entrepreneurs or small business owners. And then we also have Mint. Mint, believe it or not, is actually, Wendy, death and taxes. Mint, believe it or not, is actually a very powerful, useful resource when thinking about starting a business. Usually it's tied to personal finance and your own budgeting, but I'm actually going to walk through and kind of talk to you about why it's really powerful from a small business standpoint and a startup standpoint. So this is a little bit about Intuit, a little bit about custom fantasy rings and how I started that business. I grew up playing football my whole life. I've always wanted a massive ring, just like the Super Bowl. When you win, you get a massive ring. I was never fortunate enough to be a state champion, never got a ring, school never offered one, but I always thought it was the coolest thing ever. I played fantasy football now, I don't even know how many years, but my league, we decided we wanted to try to figure out what can we do that's different than just a trophy, or you might be familiar with belts that people give away. So my uncle happens to be a jeweler, and I asked him if he could make us a ring one year. The winner of the ring actually started wearing it around when he would go to bars, when we would hang out. People kept asking him, where did that come from? Where did that come from? How did you get that? And so at Intuit, we're really big into what we call design thinking, which I know you guys have all gone through a session in that, which is how you fall in love with the problem and not the solution, right? It's not just necessarily going out and creating a sports apparel store because you love sports apparel, or going out and creating, you know, a flower shop down the road because you love working with flowers, but it's really trying to figure out what is the customer problem you're trying to solve. And so that's kind of where it came about. We just kept hearing, hey, people are really interested and love rings and want them and customized for fantasy champions. And that's kind of how it came about and why we're still here and around today. A little bit about me. So I'm sure everyone has seen some variation of this in some form or fashion, right? Everyone thinks their career is sort of like that top line. You know, you go from school to internship to you know, entry-level job to manager to executive. We all know that for the most part, no one's life looks like that. I can tell you mine in particular does not. Mine on the bottom here, I'll kind of just walk you through a little bit about who I am. Mine doesn't necessarily follow this line to a T, but what it does is it definitely shows you the craziness in the life of what it's like to potentially want to be an entrepreneur. So I graduated from San Diego State University with a background in finance. I've always had a passion for personal finance. I've loved finance from the beginning. I talk about this a little bit later on, but I took as many business classes as I could in high school that ranged from entrepreneurship to accounting. I kind of knew that that's where my passion really lied. I went from there to a work study program and a semester abroad program called Semester at Sea. I'm not sure if anyone's really familiar with that. It's not as popular, but I basically studied abroad on a cruise ship for about 6 months. One of the places that we actually ended up going to was in Ghana. There is a city named Accra. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar, but in Accra, a lot of the residents and individuals are entrepreneurs. They create products, they sell products to a lot of the tourists that come in, and watching them and really understanding how they survive from their small business is like really what kind of fueled me to want to dive deeper and learn. Because there is a book out there, it's called Portfolios of the Poor. And it helps, and you really kind of understand how a lot of third world countries, they live on an average of $2 to $3 a day. And you're like, how is that possible? How do they do that as a small business? And so when you strip away a lot of what we learn about the foundations from the book, and you think the essence of your revenue, you think about the essence of what are some of the small expenses you have, it's quite remarkable what they're really able to do. And it kind of really fueled my passion for thinking about wanting to be an entrepreneur. I went on from Semester at Sea. I tried to work in the NFL for free. I wanted to teach personal finance to any of the NFL players or teams that were willing. If you guys are familiar with the 30 for 30 broke, where it talks about professional athletes going broke on average about 3 years after they retire from the league. That didn't work, so I realized I needed to get a job because I can't support myself without a job. And then I took a quick internship in marketing with Nike. I moved from there thinking, oh, great, I love this, but I think I'm ready to move on. I decided to give CrossFit a try. If any of you are familiar with CrossFit, I stopped playing football and wanted to find some more competition in my life. I loved CrossFit. I thought I wanted to actually start a business around it. If you guys are familiar with CrossFit, tried to open up a bunch of boxes around the country. Very quickly learned I didn't want to do that after actually running one for about 2 years. So I decided to go back to thinking about personal finance. I went to work for UBS, which is a wealth management firm, really that focuses on personal finance and individuals' investment assets. Realized that wasn't for me. Decided to move on to Accenture as a consultant. I thought it would be pretty fun to travel and work. And then again, just pivoted. I was like, I don't know that I want to continue to do this. So that's when I left, found Intuit, and actually fell into the job of personal finance here. And at the same time, I started custom fantasy rings. So again, it's kind of a crazy cycle that we will all go on. And again, nobody has the same straight line process. So now how does that tie into small businesses? And everyone's probably seen some version of this. You know, you hear that small businesses are the backbone of America. They, on average, give or take, roughly create 1.5 million new jobs per year. And so we know that small businesses are important. It's why we all want to be entrepreneurs, why we all want to start a small business. Unfortunately, COVID has had a pretty heavy impact on small businesses. You can see 31% of small businesses are currently non-operational, and hopefully that changes a little bit here in the future. But some things that we necessarily don't talk about, and I think you guys probably did when thinking about design thinking, was the reasons for failure. So number one reason, does anybody know the number one reason why businesses fail? Just curious. Either feel free to type it in the chat or unmute yourself. I see money, misuse of finance, cash flow, fear, timing, all great. Lack of knowledge. So actually the COVID actually, if you take a look at probably this year, COVID might be up there. The number one reason businesses fail is no market need. So what does that mean by no market need? It means you create, as I kind of mentioned earlier, Susan, there you go, bad idea. So you create a solution, but it's not necessarily a problem that people want solved. And so when thinking about the example, and if you take custom fantasy rings as that example, it's a very small niche market, right? It's probably not something everybody's really heard of, but for those of you who play fantasy football, it's a really big passion. And when you win, you want something to celebrate and essentially throw it in and brag to all of your friends, right? So it really ties into what is the problem that you are trying to solve. So 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. And unfortunately, of those 50%, for those of you who mentioned cash flow problems, that's number two. 82% of businesses that fail, it's because of cash flow problems. They don't understand the ins, they don't understand the outs, what's coming in, what's going out. How do I understand sort of the financial statements behind the picture? One thing that's actually a really pretty awesome statistic that I will tie back here later is 53% of small business owners attribute their knowledge to to starting a small business with actually starting a small business. Not necessarily what they took away from their entrepreneurship course, not necessarily what they took away from high school, not necessarily from any online learnings. It's that you learn going through the process. I can tell you, I took entrepreneurship in college, I took it in high school. Everything that I know about my business came from actually doing it. There are definitely things that I learned from class. I will say I started with financial statements. I had a pretty good understanding, but it wasn't until you are actually responsible for money that it really hits home. When you have to pay bills, that's when, okay, it starts to click. And I'll kind of show you some of the stuff that I went through here. So now, why is it so important thinking about personal finance and small business? 77% of small businesses are started with personal funds. right? So this might be someone's retirement savings. This might be someone's savings account. It might be, you know, if you have a day job and you're trying to create that side hustle, it might be from your salary. So personal finance and starting a small business actually ties together pretty closely. Outside of that, bank loans. So that's number two. If you guys don't know, your actual credit score impacts your ability to get a business loan. You might have the best business plan, you might have the best financials, the best projections. Doesn't matter, if you don't have a good credit score, a bank won't actually write your business a loan. So it's pretty interesting, actually. Again, all the similarities between personal finance and starting a small business. So you can see some of the other ways that rank from family and friends, online lenders, angel investors. That's probably what you hear most about, because whether it's through special acquisition companies, whether it's through raising funds from VCs, that's typically what we hear most about in the news. So we kind of talked about this a little bit early on. So what does personal finance and small business have in common? Question for you all. Feel free, type in the chat. What do we think? Awesome. All right, it is cash flow, 100%. So this is probably, I would say, the most watched video to understand cash flow. I love this. It really kind of hit home for me. So I'm actually going to go ahead and play this really quickly for you all. It's about 2 minutes. If it's too quiet, let me know.
Cash flow refers to the movement of cash into or out of an account, a business, or an investment. When cash inflows exceed outflows, this is generally considered to be a sign of good financial health, both for individuals and companies. Ed makes his living running Ed's carpets, essential to the survival of his business as well as his personal finances. Having ample cash on hand ensures that Ed can pay his employees, his creditors, and himself on time, keeping the business afloat. The same goes for Ed. He needs enough cash in his personal bank account to pay for his house, his car, and other personal expenses. Whether we are talking about Ed or his business, there are generally 3 types of cash flows. 1. Operational cash flows refer to cash received or spent as a result of a company's business activities. For example, a business like Ed's Carpets brings in cash by selling carpets and sends cash out to pay employees and suppliers. Similarly, Ed pays himself a salary, providing cash flow to his personal account. Cash will flow out to pay for his expenses such as food and housing. 2. Investment cash flows refer to cash received or spent through investing activities, basically the purchasing and selling of assets that will help grow the business, or in the case of Ed, assets that will help increase his net worth. 3. Financing cash flows refer to cash received through debt or paid out as debt repayments. For a company, issuing stock, paying down debt, and repurchasing shares would count as part of financing cash flows. For Ed, financing cash flows include any cash coming from loans or other types of debt, as well as payments going to pay down debts. If Ed's business comes up short on cash and is unable to pay its obligations, it will experience a cash flow crunch. To avoid insolvency, Ed will have to arrange some type of financing or bridge loan. A similar situation in Ed's personal accounts would also have disastrous effects that could lead to personal bankruptcy if the cash flow crunch persisted. For this reason, it is important that businesses and individuals manage their cash flow carefully and set aside emergency reserves to cushion any unexpected events.
All right, so outside of the outstanding information, I think my favorite part of that video is actually the music behind the scenes. I don't know if you guys caught it, but whoever decided from Investopia to put that music behind was a great decision. So now let's try to relate this back to something that really hits home for us. So thinking about, and if that video still is a little bit high level, let's break down exactly what this all means. Again, I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. I did 2 years of accounting in high school. I went through 3 years of accounting in college, and it really didn't stick. once until, again, I had to do it because of a small business, but then also when someone laid it out for me in terms of personal finance. So really quickly, either show of hands or in the chat, how many of you budget today for yourself, not for your small business? How many of you have a budget for yourself? See a couple hands, not everyone. Awesome. Okay, so I see yesterday. So you can think of your financial statements. Let's start with it from yourself. So we have net worth. So who can really quickly tell me what your net worth is outside of just reading assets minus debt? Who can tell me what net worth is? Anyone? Feel free, want to unmute or type in the chat. Linda, go for it.
Net worth should be what you have in, like, I was going to say assets, but things like cash, etc., minus the debt that you owe.
Okay, awesome. So who can,
I mean, it says it right there, but
yeah. So who can give me an example of some assets? What are some assets that one might have? Your house, okay.
Your house,
great.
or the equity in your house.
Yep.
Cash in your bank.
Cash in your bank. Anyone else? Anything?
I'd say like anything of value to the person.
Yeah. Okay. I see stocks, savings investments, cars, house.
Apartment buildings.
Apartment buildings. Awesome. So checking account, savings account, retirement, car. I see, yes, Bitcoin, it would be considered an asset. So what do you think is considered debt? Someone give me some examples of debt.
Credit card debt.
Credit card debt, mortgage, student loans. These are amazing. What else? Bills, loans. You guys are hitting it right on the head. This is perfect. So when someone asks you for your net worth, it is a specific date in time, right? You can ask someone for their net worth. It's pretty taboo to actually talk about your net worth, but if somebody were to ask you your net worth, you would give them a snapshot, a specific date in time. You necessarily might not say, what is your net worth from April 1 to April 30th? Because let's just say if you decide to buy a home or do something within that, right? You can't determine someone's net worth over a range of time. It's a very specific date in which you can determine your net worth. So now how does that equate to net income, right? So we have our income minus our expenses. This one's a little bit more straightforward when thinking about, for those of you that have a budget, right? It's your income minus your expenses creates what you have, your net income for the month. So the difference is this is a date range, right? So if you, let's just use your day job as an example of this. You get paid for an entire month 2 times, or maybe if you get paid monthly, whatever it might be, but you can, your net income might be April 1 through April 30th. And it might not be the 1st to the 30th, but it could be from the 15th to the 15th. The difference again is that it is a date range. So now how does this actually tie, and how can we think about this from a small business standpoint? So the 2 most critical things for a small business for me that helped me understand what was most important was a balance sheet and an income statement. So if income statement also means profit and loss. So when thinking about, now kind of tie it back a little bit to our personal finance lesson that we just went through. So the balance sheet, if we have assets, the equation, again, in order to understand your assets is liabilities plus owner's equity is equal to your assets. So what are some assets that a small business might have?
Machinery.
Say that again, Mary.
Machinery.
Machinery, yeah. Equipment,
yeah.
laptops.
Property.
I see inventory, property.
Engineers.
Engineers, okay. Nobody mentioned cash. I would say cash would be part of your assets, right? So accounts receivable is an asset. Inventory, real estate, auto, you guys called it all out. What might be some liabilities that a small business might have?
Rent.
Rent, wages, good.
Competition.
What else? So competition might not necessarily be a liability that you'd have on a balance sheet because there is no actual tangible value to that. but I would say it's something you need to think about for sure. I see loans.
Anything
Cost.
Unearned revenue?
One more time.
Unearned revenue?
Yeah. So, yep. So accounts pay, you mean like accounts payable, unearned revenue, and if you mean like accounts receivable, so that would be considered an asset because it's money that you're owed. Accounts payable, on the other hand, would be considered a liability. So again, tying it back to personal finance and thinking about your net worth, right? The balance sheet shows the net worth of your business. So it's a specific date and time. If somebody were to ask you, what is basically your balance sheet, and they asked for a given range, you can think of the same thing. Well, I can't tell you that because it's a snapshot of one moment of time. So now moving over to the income statement, right? Similar to net income. So it's your revenue minus your expenses gets you your net income. So very similar. We have our income plus any gains that we might have, or expenses minus any losses. So some of you guys actually called this out earlier. So income plus gains, what that means is maybe if you sell a company car, that would be potentially a gain. On the losses, maybe you have, I actually saw somebody call this out earlier that was pretty good. Setting a lawsuit might be considered an expense that you might have that unexpectedly kind of comes up. But the similar back to when thinking about your net income, it is a range, right? So your income statement is going to give you your net income for a range or a date in time. And so really when somebody put the two aspects together, I was able to understand my net worth and my net income. And then when they tied it to the balance sheet and income statement is really when that hit home for me. And so you can think of them very similar. So for, I wish I had a textbook to kind of refer to here, but I don't. These are just examples of balance sheets and of income statements here. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have our assets, which if you go all the way down to the bottom, you can see your assets will always equal your liability plus your owner's equity, always. Always, always, always. If it doesn't, then you have something wrong within your balance sheet. Your income statement, this is just a high level. You'll notice things that are on this income statement that you might not necessarily have as a startup, which I'm actually going to tie into here, how we can use Mint as a small business. But again, it's a snapshot in time given the period. So now, how can we actually think about this when looking at Mint? So this was actually a hack that someone told me about. I've always used Mint personally. And then someone said, if you really want to understand the ins and outs, your cash flow of your business, why don't you use a budgeting app? And so Mint, for example, is actually meant for personal finance, for us to help create our own budgets. Again, right when I started, I really still quite did not understand a balance sheet and income statement. What really helped me is actually having Mint connect to my business bank account. And I was actually able to visualize where money is going and where it's coming in. It sounds kind of crazy to use a personal finance app to track your business spending, but it gives you a deep dive analysis into your business. So what I've connected to here is, it's actually not a business account. So we have fictional student data. So, but what I want to show you, the power behind this, because it will help you understand where your money's coming in and where it's going out. So if you have a small business and you want to understand that, and you're looking for a free tool to help you, for me, this was the best tool. And there's a bunch of personal finance apps that are out there. But Mint happened to work the best for me. And this was before I was even actually working for Intuit. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Mint, one of the most powerful things that it does is it shows you your trends. So it shows you where and how you're spending your money. So you can think about this from a business standpoint, right? So if you are spending money out of your business account, and again, keep in mind, this is a student fictional account, so it doesn't look like a business today, but you can break down by category where you're spending your money. So if you wanted to say, how much am I spending on office supplies? You can very quickly click into office supplies. So let's just use bills and utilities as an example because it's on here. So I want to understand all the bills and utilities that are coming out of my company because it's part of my income statement, and I want to know my net income. So I can click and actually see every single payment that my business goes through. So instead of looking at an income statement when your eyes sort of gloss over, this is a great way to really understand when your money's going out and when your money's coming in. And I started doing this. I don't know many businesses that start doing this, but it really helped me understand where and how to do that. So the other thing outside of just these trends, let me go ahead. I'm going to go into transactions. Oh, so you guys can see this. So it actually captures every single transaction for you. So when you have a small business and you really want to see where that money is going, you can. Every transaction down to the detail. So this was really helpful for me. Might not necessarily be helpful for everyone, but if you really want to understand the financial statements, the balance sheet, and your income statement, this will be a help and a great way to start doing that. I see a question from Alfredo. To start a business account at the beginning, can we use our personal accounts or do we need a business account? Does this app produce statements from the IRS? Is it expensive? So great questions, Alfredo. So do you need a business account to start a business? I mean, technically, no, you don't. But if you wanted to, like, if you're trying to create an LLC, right, you will need a business account. You can't just use your bank account. And so what I would, in order to create and actually get a business bank account, you need that LLC first. But I've heard of a ton of people in the San Diego startup community down here, if they want to start something and see if it's a viable company or if it's a problem that they're worth solving, what they'll try and do is they maybe get like PayPal, and they'll see, let's just say they're trying to sell sports cards, right? Before they realize if they want to see if this is a business and they want to go through and create, maybe it's that LLC or it's that S Corp or whatever it might be, they might try and sell it first, where you might not be able to get a business account up front. So the app is free. It's not expensive to use. Again, I will always 100% recommend free things first before you actually try and pay for stuff, which I will talk about subscriptions here in a minute, because it was something that actually bogged me down when we first started. So let me go ahead and jump back into the presentation here. So thinking about subscriptions, when you start a business, and if you use Shopify or if you use Squarespace or you use any of those companies that help you start a website, they will ask you, do you want to integrate apps? Do you want to start this? Do you want to do this? Do you want to take on this? A lot of them will give you the first month free. And then you're like, oh, this is great, until you forget to stop those subscriptions. And you very quickly realize you now owe, over $1,000 worth of first month subscriptions. And these are all different types of things that help a small business run. If you talk to anyone over the phone, whether it's from ShipBob to Afterpay to Instagram to Zoho is one that I use to help me understand how customers are using my website. They will try to always upsell you. And so they're very smart about how they do this. And actually, now to relate this back to personal finance, our Mint users, we did a study and research on our Mint customers, and we found that they spend over $600 a year on their subscriptions, so over $50 a month, and most of them probably don't even know it. And so it's very easy to do the same thing with your business, and this 100% affects your cash flow. Very similar. So now when we think about, again, tying it back to the balance sheet and tying it back to your income statement, what might be some things that you think affect your cash flow? So remember, this is money coming in or money going out. Question for you all. What are some things that affect your cash flow?
Sales.
Sales, great. What else?
If your business has busier seasons.
Sorry, I don't have enough of the camera up to see who said that, but who said that? Because that is great feedback.
Me, Holly.
Holly, awesome. That was great. So we will get there in a second. Business cycles. But what are some other things before we do that affect cash flow? Unexpected expenses. Great, Lauren. Broken machinery. So we have cash revenue, payroll, supplies, rent, app subscriptions, anything that is tangible with cash. So marketing, Ahmed, not necessarily efficiency. I mean, efficiency might be able to be tied to, let's say, purchasing supplies as an example, right? Let's just say you have somebody who's going out constantly to buy supplies. That might be inefficient, but there's not necessarily a tangible value to that. So what are some things that don't affect cash flow? So efficiency, Ahmed, would be one of them, but still detrimental. What else? Any takers? So we have accounts payable and accounts receivable. Can anybody help me understand why accounts payable and accounts receivable have no effect on cash flow?
Because
So
these are either in the future. I mean,
yes.
either they both in
Yep.
the future.
That's perfect. So correct. It doesn't affect your cash flow today because they are in the future. So we have prepaid expenses. We have purchasing on credit. So why is this also important to understand your cash flow? Because we go through business cycles. So just using custom fantasy rings as an example, and I'm going to actually tie this back to one that we probably all are too familiar with. So at the end of the NFL season is typically when I see very high demand. And then very quickly after that, demand shoots all the way down. And then we sort of have this lull off season where there's no NFL, people really aren't thinking about it. And then the season starts, it upticks, and then it goes back down during the middle of the season. And then we have the high demand again at the end of the season. But why it's so important for cash flow is because you have to be able to sustain a business through all of it. Just because you necessarily aren't, whether it's selling rings or selling software or selling services because it's out of season, you still have to sustain your business with cash flow. So one example we probably all know of, Spirit Halloween. Who's familiar with Spirit Halloween? I see a bunch of heads nodding and some thumbs up. Why are we familiar with them? Because usually around September, maybe even slightly earlier, Spirit Halloween pops up on every corner in the stores where nothing has been occupied for years. They are the perfect example of cash flow and thinking about how do they sustain a business year round. Halloween is one really small point in time, right? It's one date of the year. But for some reason, Spirit Halloween, without fail, almost like death and taxes, is going to pop back up on the corner right next to your house. So quick question, how do you think they have the ability to do this? What are some things that potentially changes for them? Like what helps them from a cash flow standpoint, do you think that they do to keep their business afloat?
Probably seasonal employees.
Great. Seasonal employees is definitely one.
Saving.
Okay, what else?
Temporary leases.
Bingo. That is the big one. So imagine if Spirit Halloween rented 12 months out of the year at the local shopping center next to you. They would probably be losing money and hemorrhaging money hand over fist. But they always seem to pop up into these spaces that no one's occupied, and they're only there for about a month. And then their employees are seasonal. And then what do they do after that? They sell everything online. My guess is you probably have never even thought to go on Spirit Halloween's website, but most of their business is actually driven, well, all of it is driven online after the sale of the season. So they are what I would call a perfect and prime example of managing your cash flow, right? And understanding your income statement, because really what they're doing is helping them make it through the year through their business cycles. Alfredo, I see buying from China and cutting their liabilities. So my guess is all of their supplies probably come from overseas. That would be my guess. Don't quote me on that because I'm not a Spirit Halloween expert. So what are some of the biggest impacts? I actually clicked too fast, but some of the biggest impacts that you have on your cash flow. Number one popped up a little bit too early here, so I can't actually quiz you all on it. But number one is low profit. And low profit, which is not necessarily tied to low revenue, there is actually a pretty big difference. So if you think someone might have, $10 million in revenue, but if their expenses are over $10 million, then they're going to have tremendously low profits. I would say low profits is probably the one biggest problem with cash flow. Anybody have any ideas, suggestions, or thoughts? How would one company change their low profits? What are some things that they can do to actually turn around potentially low profits?
Cut cost.
Cut costs.
Find a better manufacturer.
Costco. I see Costco sell by volume. What else?
Raise prices.
One off. Raise prices. Okay.
Find a better manufacturer, lower cost.
Okay. So you guys hit on a ton of different areas. So let's talk to increase sales price. That is definitely number one. So they can increase their sales price, which you can do, but you have to be careful. This is something that I actually did. So when I first started, our rings were about half the price of actually what we sell them for today. And our profits were much smaller back then, and it was actually really hurting us, even though our business was growing tremendously. And I couldn't just double the price sale because most likely customers would potentially leave. So over time, we slowly increased our prices instead of just going from $100 to $200 or to $500, whatever that your product might be. So I also heard decrease expenses. That is another great way to do it. Decreasing your cost of goods sold. So that could be anything from, I can use as an example, we ship rings out in these boxes. I thought we had to have these really, really fancy wooden custom boxes up front. And then I learned as soon as I traded them out, customers didn't leave. They didn't necessarily need to care. So there's ways that you can definitely decrease your expenses over time. And one thing that you can actually use to do this that kind of helps you track it is your gross profit margin. So for those of you that aren't aware, your gross profit margin is what's the best way of saying this? So your gross profit margin percentage is going to be your gross profit divided by your revenue. So really quickly, your gross profit is your revenue minus your expenses. So if you take your revenue minus your expenses and divide it by your revenue, you will get your gross profit margin. And that is one of the best ways to track it over time to help you understand, and you can tie it back to your balance sheet. So number one, low profit. Number two, overspending. Has anybody ever had a problem with overspending? Whether it's from a small business or you want to shop. I think
Yes.
we all at some point in time have gone through this, right? So thinking back to those subscription companies, or when you sign up for Shopify and they can connect you to all of these different apps and you're like, whoa, where did these all come from? These are companies you've never heard of before. This definitely happened to me. So one of the biggest things that I heard from my customers was, I want to see what I'm building before I buy it. I'm buying this custom ring, but I don't get to see it ahead of time. Like, I don't know that I really want to buy. So is anyone familiar with Nike ID, or like where you were used to be able to customize your shoes from Nike before you bought them? That was like the first example of this that I could remember. I probably spent weeks trying to figure out how to find this. And there's something called a customizer that allows you to do this. So I met with a couple of companies that did this, and then I finally met with this one who had the slick salesman, showed me the ins and outs, all the bells and whistles, and I was like, yes, I have to have that. And I ended up probably spending 5 times the amount of what I needed to get past functionality. And so what I'm going to actually show you guys an example of this, because I think it's key. So, and when you think about like building a website, this can tie to building a website, is do you need to pay somebody $10,000 to build you a functional website, or can you do it for $5,000, right? I think those are 2 good examples, but let me give you a quick showing. So this is kind of what it looked like for me, right? Nike ID, what they did was change colors. They did a couple of fancy things. I thought I had to have all these bells and whistles, and I paid way more money than I probably need to be able to showcase what a custom ring looks like, because this is what I thought customers wanted to see. So this is just a real life example of what overspending does. And it actually ended up hurting us because I needed some of this cash to pay for other things. Number 3, inventory management. So I saw somebody call out just-in-time inventory. Who was that? It came from Patrick. Inventory management. So if you have too much inventory on hand, your inventory, it can spoil, it can go bad. A lot of it's going to end up sitting on your balance sheet. And when it sits in your inventory, it's not necessarily being sold, right? So Patrick, I'm actually curious because you called it out. Can you tell me what just-in-time, or can you help everyone understand what just-in-time inventory is?
Delivering goods when customer order it just few weeks.
Yeah, so that's a great example. So I'm going to tie this back to, I'll tie it back to something that we change internally, but then I think the kings of this might be Toyota. Their supply chain, and I don't know if anyone has ever tried to build a customized Toyota before. What they do on their website is they allow you to actually go through and build and customize your own car, but they obviously don't build that car before you purchase it. So you purchase it, and then what they do is they basically try to cut down and condense the time frame for building the car for you. So instead of having all of these pieces ordered way ahead of time, they essentially wait until the orders come in. So let me give you another example of, this is something that we did. We used to order a bunch of these rings up front, thousands and thousands of them, thinking we need to get these out as quick as we can. It was a bunch of cash that we shelled out to have these rings to get them out on time. It actually ended up hurting us and having us lose money, a ton of money up front. And we actually switched it to where we said, great, we only actually order the rings after they're customized. So now I'm actually being paid up front before I actually need to buy inventory. And so that directly affects cash flow and inventory management. And obviously you can't necessarily do that with all like product versus services, but it's just one quick example. And Ahmed, I see, but you can run out of stock, correct? You can run out of stock, but as over time, you can build your forecast. So if you have the business and the cyclical cycle, you'll understand your demands over time. So if you need to, at some point, build up your stock, or you need to build up your supplies, then you can do that. Obviously, Toyota doesn't keep any, they have to have some supply, right? They can't just get one order and then order. They've figured out their supply chain. And I think Amazon's probably another great example of this, where with Prime, they have to have the supply on demand. And sometimes they do happen to run out. Next, credit lines. This is something I think that actually is probably ever evolving, but credit lines are actually, this is where it's also tied to your personal finance. So remember when I was talking about credit scores early on, you might not necessarily be able to get a credit line up front, or when you think about accounts payable up front, potentially from a bank because of your credit score. But if someone's paying you and you're waiting for their payment on accounts receivable, that's going to affect your cash flow. But there's actually new companies out there. Is anyone familiar with Affirm or Afterpay, for example? Do any of those names ring a bell to anyone? I see some nods. So for those of you that are nodding your heads, it means you shop. So good job. So if you shop a lot online, you will have noticed that a lot of these e-commerce websites now offer Affirm or Afterpay. So instead of accounts receivable waiting for payments from your customers, there are these companies, Affirm, Afterpay, there's several others, they actually take on the liability. So as a small business, you get the cash flow now, instead of having to wait for accounts receivable. And that's what, when you sell a product, that's one way of doing it. If you sell a service, necessarily you can't sell it through Afterpay or through a firm. But is anybody familiar with 210 net 20? Does that ring a bell to anyone? So I see a couple heads. So what that means is if you pay within 10 days, you might get a 2% discount. And if you don't, you'll end up paying within 30 days and you pay the full price. What you're actually doing is, number one, it depends on how quickly the cash flow is coming in, but then it becomes the perception, right? So what you can do to offset is you can change prices around a little bit. You can do things that you need to do to make sure that you get that cash flow to come in. Really quickly before I move on, I want to see, does anybody have any questions on the impacts to cash flow? All right, I see no questions coming up in the chat and some people shaking their heads.
Jared, excuse me. I think
Yeah.
Maria was asking, wouldn't you have to pay more for cost of goods sold in relation to inventory management?
Wouldn't you have to pay more for cost of goods sold? So technically, so depending on, I would say, your supplier and your vendor who you work with. Usually if you buy in bulk, then yes, you may have to pay more for cost of goods sold. But you need to weigh the opportunity costs, or I guess potentially the sunk costs of what happens if you have too much inventory and it spoils, or what happens if things break down. So that's where you need to, I would say over time, you're going to have to balance your cost of goods sold and when you order supplies versus having too much inventory on hand. It's a great question.
So in case of your rings, you know, because rings are very personal, and I cannot wrap around my head around how you operate when, you know, for something so very personal. I mean, how does that affect your business, and how does that affect the cost of, you know, that you have to pay?
It's a great question. So the biggest cost that we had up front was purchasing a ton of these rings and having them sit around. So I think actually my business might not necessarily be the best business to talk about this, because what we ended up doing was we don't pre-order any rings at all. Because we sell custom rings, we wait for the payments, and then I actually then reach out to our production team and our jeweler, who then builds them after we receive payment. So when thinking about the rings themselves, that's the biggest cost of goods sold that we have. When I order them, because of my, basically the trust factor essentially that I have tied back to the jeweler, we have one set price for a ring. If we happen to grow 10, 15, 100%, maybe that price will change. Or if we significantly decrease our order volume, we go over this every year with them. But I don't necessarily order the exact number of rings every month. We basically, what we do is when we get a set of rings in, let's just say it's a given week, we'll send them off to the jeweler and then they send them back to us. So I actually don't have to prepay for any rings that customers order, because I don't necessarily know what customizes that they want, and it helps me not keep inventory on hand.
Yes, thank you. My question, I think, was, does that affect your margin at the end? Or you basically balance it with the cash that you have at hand instead of having them on an inventory? So you balance with that.
Yeah, so there's ways you can balance it. It actually doesn't affect my margin, because of when you think about what it costs to, what we sell the ring for and what it costs to make us the ring. So the ring itself, the margin doesn't change. But if you think actually about whether it might be the wooden boxes, or it might be some of these other things, if they come broken, or if they're sitting on the shelves too long and they break, that is where, when you take the whole picture of cost of goods sold into account, that's where things may start to change. But the cost of like our wooden boxes, they're anywhere from like $1 to $1.50, versus the rings are much more expensive.
Thank you.
And then Frank, I see, what research or source do you find a source of vendors that can make rings or products? So there are a ton of different places to go out there. For me, what I did, I used Alibaba. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Alibaba. It was one of the best ways for me to figure out how to make products. I started stateside here, and it was very expensive to make massive, like quarter to a half pound rings. And so because it really dramatically affected our profit margins and simply we couldn't sell rings at the prices we need to, we were able to find jewelers overseas through Alibaba who actually make the quality of the rings better than what we were able to do here. So that's a great question, Frank. All right, just want to be conscious of time. I know we wanted to make sure we had about 15 minutes for about Q&A here at the end. Cash flow analysis. This is something you can do for every part of your business. So whether you're buying, I don't know why I decided to go into semi-trucks. I've never looked into purchasing a semi-truck before, but I ended up going down a rabbit hole after I decided I wanted to use a semi-truck as an example. So if you want to use cars or company cars as an example, you might have monthly payments. For purchasing software, a lot of software can be done on quarterly payments. It could be done on monthly payments. And then when you go through, if you need to order like phone service, I think we still all happen to get this if we move and we try to move our internet and phone bill with us, they give us that one-time installation fee. Why that's still a thing, I don't necessarily know. But then you have annual payments. And so these are all different types of cash flow analysis that you'll need to go through when thinking about building out, whether it's taking your net income or building out your balance sheet. Because again, when you take it and tie it back to the business cycle that you might go through, regardless of if you're at the peak, if you're in your trough, you are still going to have to make, whether it's these monthly payments, these quarterly payments, and these annual payments. So really understanding your balance sheet and really understanding your income statement are probably the two key critical pieces to doing that. And tying it back to yourself first is probably one of the easiest ways to learn about doing that. So starting with building a budget for yourself, understanding how to go through your net worth and your net income, and then tying it into the balance sheet and income statement. So last thing I want to, just piece of advice before I'll open this up for Q&A is one of the biggest things that helped me with starting a business was finding a mentor. Find someone who has started a small business, who has gone through the experience. It doesn't necessarily need to tie directly back to what you want to do. But if you Google like business mentor programs, there are a ton of different like mentorship groups that they can pair you with mentors if you're not familiar. One thing that I actually did, I went on LinkedIn and I found someone who sold a product. I had no connections. I just asked them to connect with me, and then after a couple conversations, he agreed that he would help be my mentor. But finding a mentor that's gone through this, who will help you with the experience and the knowledge, is tremendous. And that's unfortunately something that you don't necessarily get when taking an entrepreneurship course, but I would highly, highly recommend trying to find a mentor. So with that, I know we've got about 10 minutes, give or take. I want to turn it back over to you guys, whether you have personal finance questions, if you have questions about starting a business, questions about stuff that I've done, the table is yours. All right, first question I see from Alfredo. Is it better to outsource rather than to produce in the US? So that's a tricky question. For me, I'm a big believer in the US economy. I try to do as much as I can here in the US because I want to support it. There is at some point when you have to weigh the justification of creating and sustaining your own business versus doing things outsourced versus in the US. So it's kind of up to you, Alfredo, and what you think you need to do as a business. For me personally, and what we do is we try to do and create as much as we can here in the US to support our own economy. From Patrick, how important is it using Kickstarter as a way of starting a business? So let me actually, Patrick, go back a couple of slides here. So I don't know that it's necessarily critical and important, but it is definitely one way that you can start a business. I have seen, I don't even know how many times I've seen a Kickstarter kind of come across, you know, my LinkedIn or come across anywhere where someone's trying to create or start capital to start their business. But it'll work. I can't say I've been successful in it. I have tried before. It doesn't necessarily always work. It's pretty difficult because you have to create a marketing campaign around it. Usually you'll tend to end up getting mostly friends, family, and other local businesses that you're tied with to end up helping you. So I would try to maybe think about what are other ways, and maybe Kickstarter is one way to help, but I wouldn't just rely on it, Patrick. Brianni, I don't know that I can actually answer when you say how much does Kickstarter take out of the funds that you raise. I'm not too entirely sure. I think you get all of it, but I'm not 100% certain. So don't quote me on that one. All right, I see. What is better, equity sharing or going into debt at 15% with a bank? Which one would I do? That's a great question, Alfredo. I think depending on who you talk to, there's a point at which you over leverage your debt too much, but I would say it's dependent on the time and when you are trying to raise funds. So for those of you who are not familiar, equity sharing means you're willing, think about Shark Tank. You're willing to give away equity in your company or a percentage in your company for cash. There are ways to do valuations of your company to make sure that it's even. So if, you know, to get the valuation based on your revenue or however you might want to do it. I personally, I don't know that I'd want to take on debt at 15%, but I would always prefer to take out loans first, but not make sure that you over leverage your loans. I would want to hold on to the equity as long as you can. I see two couple more questions. One from Edith. What is the best way to track business expenses, Mint, QuickBooks, or Excel? I'm going to kind of work down the way. I see a couple more questions coming in here. So I personally, Edith, I would start on Mint. Mint is going to help you understand and visually see and track your funds. But then at some point, if your business takes off, I've moved since to QuickBooks, and that's actually how we run our business with actual accounting software instead of just tracking it through Mint. But Mint will help you, again, really visualize and see where your money is going. Again, whether it's spending it on lunch for employees or for yourself for the day, or it's spending it on software. So you'll probably need to actually track your business expenses at some point, you know, through accounting software, but you can definitely start with Mint, and I would recommend that. I see CCSF Vets Hutchinson. You gave the example of Nike ID in terms of upgrading you've done to your website. Was it a negative impact on your cash flow or positive impact? And what upgrade help did you see with your customers? Great question. So this definitely, so number one, it had a negative impact because we spent a ton of money on it. So now the question is, why did we do it? So the thing that we kept hearing from our customers, which we regularly survey, and I would highly recommend you do this, if you're trying to figure out a problem that you need to solve, is ask your customers or ask them potentially maybe why they're not purchasing your product or how can this be more beneficial to them. And so after people purchase products, we typically send a survey, and or to those, what you can do is you can see who's added stuff to the cart and then they've left things in your actually not purchased to can well. And so we can reach out, and the number one thing we heard was we actually can't see our rings before we purchase them, and we want to be able to do that. So that was the reason why we did it. But the problem became we decided to actually overspend. We probably put too much resources into the tool and didn't actually need it to be quote unquote as slick as it was to see all the customizations to actually satisfy what the customers were looking for. So that's a great question. Jessica, I see. What books or podcasts would you recommend for business or finance? Let me think about that one, Jessica. If you find me on LinkedIn, I can send you a bunch. I have a ton over here. I'm not a big podcast listener, but I do read a ton of business books, so I'm definitely happy to help you if you want to reach out on LinkedIn. I'll jump to that so you guys can see that at the end here. All right, so let me keep moving down. Is it possible, Alfredo? Yes, you can follow or connect with me on LinkedIn. Please feel free. Angelica, how do I determine which country is best to manufacture my product? How do we determine if the product cost for international customers, if a product is sold through e-commerce? I see on Shark Tank a lot of passion for made in the USA products, but the sharks cringe and the cost is more. So I think I talked about this a little bit early on. So sharks, the reason why they cringe is because if you produce here in the US, it's going to be a higher cost. It's almost no question about it. But your customers, they're going to want to see more often than not, potentially made in the USA. So I think that's where you're going to have to weigh the costs. And I would highly recommend you potentially talk to customers. Ask them, if we made these products elsewhere, not in the US, and you couldn't tell a difference, would you still order from us? If you at some point get to successful where maybe you're selling 1 million plus units, at some point you're going to have to figure out, when does this become detrimental to my business because the producing in the US is too high, right? So at what point do customers not purchase from you because cost is too high? It's something you're going to have to kind of weigh. So if you're thinking about VC funds, if you want to go on Shark Tank, you're right, they will probably cringe if you say made or produced in the USA, because it's really tied to the products are too high in cost. I see from Holly, how is purchased on credit listed under no effect on cash flow? Seems like it affects cash, might not be immediate, but you have to pay it back and utilize. So great question, Holly. So the reason why it does not affect your cash flow right away is because you're not paying for it that date and time. So if, let's just say I purchased something today, but I'm purchasing on credit for 1 year from now, or sorry, purchasing on credit for maybe next month. Let's not use 1 year from now. I don't know many businesses that will give you leniency for a year. For 1 month from now, then that's when it will affect my cash. So if you're purchasing on credit, you might not have to pay for it right away. But then when you think about the next month, and if you're taking a look at your income statement, then that's when it might hit. So great question. Shauna, have you heard of La Cocina or other business incubation programs? I have not, but I'm interested in learning more. I see Stephen mentions he has a personal finance podcast. All right, let me see. All right, last question I hear. Oh, Stephen, it's talking about his personal finance. All right, I see no other questions, and we are at the 3:30 mark. So Vivian, I'm going to hand it back over to you. And again, please, everyone, feel free if you want to connect on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy.
Thank you so much, Jared. And I would like to also acknowledge that last semester we were able to offer the entrepreneurship finance class for free, even with the textbook, access to Mint, and all those through Intuit. So thank you very much, Jared, and for your team for supporting City College of San Francisco, especially our program. Thank you.
Of course, of course.
Mhm. And for those who, again, who just joined us, this is a series of various workshops to complement your requirements. I heard a lot of questions pertaining to funding. There are many different sources of funding, and crowdfunding is just one of those. So we have some recorded workshops in the past provided by Indiegogo when they came over on campus. So you can access those through our YouTube channel. And so with the incubator, we just had last March 21st, we have 3 incubators and 3 accelerator programs who presented. So all of those might be able to help you with some of the questions today. So please access the YouTube channel. And Jared, again, I know you are really extending more than what you really normally do. So I personally would like to, again, my gratitude for all your support.
No problem.
Hopefully we can do it again next time.
Yes, definitely. Thanks again, everyone. Have an awesome time, and don't hesitate if you have any further questions. Always available.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.